I'd always thought of my life with Clara as a quiet symphony. Steady, predictable, each note falling where it should. 20 years married, 2 kids grown and off to college, and a house in the suburbs that smelled of her lavender candles and my coffee-stained bookshelves. She was the kind of woman who ironed my shirts without being asked, who left little notes in my lunchbox even after all these years. "Don't work too hard, James," she'd write, her handwriting a soft cursive that hadn't changed since our dating days. I was a tax accountant, a man of numbers, not grand gestures, but I loved her in my own steady way. It started with the hummingbirds. Clara had taken up bird watching about a year ago, after our youngest, Mia, left for school. She'd sit on the back porch with her binoculars, her face lighting up at the blur of wings. I'd tease her about it, call her my nature girl, and she'd laugh, swatting my arm. But then she started going on these outings, weekend trips with the local birding group. I didn't mind. I'd spend those days reorganizing my stamp collection or catching up on spreadsheets, happy she'd found something to fill the empty nest. The first crack came in late autumn. She'd been gone for a Saturday trip, and when she came back, her cheeks were flushed, her eyes too bright. "The group spotted a ruby-throated hummingbird," she said, unpacking her bag. But there was something off. Her fingers lingered too long on the zipper, and she wouldn't meet my gaze. I brushed it off. Clara wasn't the type to hide things. She'd once confessed to eating my last slice of birthday cake with such guilt you'd think she'd robbed a bank. Weeks passed, and the outings grew longer. She'd leave early, come back late, her clothes smelling faintly of pine and something else. Something musky, unfamiliar. I'd ask how it went, and she'd ramble about birds I'd never heard of, her words tumbling over each other like she'd rehearsed them. I started noticing other things. Her phone buzzing more often, her stepping outside to take calls, her laughter sounding sharper, less hers. My Clara, my soft-spoken Clara, was shifting into someone I didn't recognize. One night I couldn't sleep. She'd come home from a trip, showered immediately, and fallen asleep with her back to me. A wall of silence between us. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight. The next morning, I found her binoculars on the kitchen counter. On a whim, I picked them up, turned them over. There, scratched into the metal, was a name, Elliot. Not hers, not mine. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was nothing. Friends, maybe, a loan from the group. I put them back and went to work, the name echoing in my head like a drumbeat I couldn't silence. Elliot. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was a splinter under my skin. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I'm not a man who leaps. I calculate. I observe. So I started watching Clara closer, piecing together the puzzle she didn't know I'd found. Her birding trips weren't just weekends now. They stretched into weekdays, odd hours. She'd say, "Oh, James, the group's meeting at dusk to catch the nocturnal feeders." And I'd nod, pretending I didn't notice how her hands shook when she packed her bag. I dug deeper. She'd left her laptop open one evening. A rare slip. I wasn't snooping, not really, just glancing while she showered. There it was, an email from Elliot Grayson, subject line, "Next spot." My pulse hammered as I clicked. "Can't wait to see you again, Clara. The ridge last time was unforgettable. Bring that green scarf. I loved how it looked on you." My vision blurred. A scarf. My Clara didn't wear scarves. Not since I'd known her. But there it was in her closet the next day, green and silky, tucked behind her winter coats like a secret. I knew Elliot Grayson. Not personally, but I'd heard the name. He was a local photographer, mid-40s, divorced, the kind of man who wore linen shirts and talked about capturing the soul of nature. Clara had mentioned him once, casually months ago. "Elliot's leading the group this weekend. He's so passionate about the birds." Passionate. The word curdled in my memory now. I Googled him. His website was full of artsy shots. Hummingbirds mid-flight, landscapes at dawn. And there, in one corner, a photo of him. Tan, sharp jaw, eyes that smirked at the camera. I didn't tell her I knew. Instead, I let the silence grow. She'd chatter about her day, and I'd nod, my mind spinning. I started tracking her trips, cross-referencing her stories with weather reports, bird migration patterns. She'd say she'd been at Miller's Creek, but the creek was dry that week, no birds to speak of. Lies stacked up like receipts I couldn't balance. One night, she came home with a scratch on her neck, faint but jagged. "A branch," she said, tugging her collar up. I didn't believe her. Branches don't leave marks like that. Fingernails do. I bought a tracker. Small, discreet, the kind you slip into a car's wheel well. I told myself it was for proof, not paranoia. The first time I checked it, my hands shook as the app loaded. She'd gone to a cabin an hour north, not a birding spot, not a public trail. Private land. I sat in my office, staring at the blinking dot, my coffee going cold. Clara was upstairs, humming, oblivious. I wanted to storm up there, demand answers, but I didn't. I waited. Revenge isn't loud. Not at first. It's patient. The cabin became my obsession. I drove there one Saturday while Clara was out with the group. It was a squat, cedar-sided thing nestled in the woods, a gravel road winding up to it like a snake. No cars in the driveway, no signs of life, just a stillness that mocked me. I parked a quarter-mile away, walked up, my breath fogging in the crisp air. The windows were dark, but I peeked through a gap in the curtains. A couch, a wood stove, a rug that looked too expensive for a rustic hideaway. On the table, a bottle of wine, Clara's favorite Merlot. My throat tightened. I didn't break in. I'm not that man, not yet. But I took photos, cataloged every detail. The mailbox had Grayson scrawled on it in faded marker. Elliot's place. I sat in my car afterward, hands gripping the wheel, imagining them there. Her laughter, his hands, that green scarf trailing across the floor. The image burned, but I didn't let it consume me. I needed more. I needed certainty. Back home, Clara was different. She'd touch me less, her hugs perfunctory, her kisses dry pecks on the cheek. She'd spend hours on her phone, smiling at the screen in a way she hadn't smiled at me in years. I'd ask what was funny, and she'd wave it off, just a silly bird meme. I stopped asking. Instead, I mirrored her distance, let her think I was oblivious. She didn't notice how my eyes followed her, how I memorized her lies. The tracker kept talking. Twice more, she went to that cabin. Once, she stayed overnight, texting me she'd crashed at a friend's, because the group had lost track of time. I didn't reply, couldn't. My fingers hovered over the phone, wanting to type. Which friend? Clara? Elliot? But I didn't. I poured a whiskey, sat in the dark, and let the anger simmer. It wasn't time yet. I started planning. Not confrontation, something bigger. I'd always been good with numbers, with systems. Revenge, I realized, was just another equation. Inputs of pain, outputs of justice. I didn't know what the final sum would be, but I knew it'd be cruel, precise, and hers to carry. For now, I gathered evidence. Let the wound fester. She thought she was clever. She had no idea who I was becoming. Evidence piled up like snowdrifts. The tracker logged her trips, 5 to the cabin in 2 months, plus detours to a diner, a motel, places she'd never mentioned. I found a receipt in her coat pocket. Coffee for 2, paid in cash, dated a day she'd said she was alone. I kept it all in a locked drawer in my office. Photos, maps, timestamps. My little ledger of betrayal. Clara didn't suspect a thing. She'd kiss my forehead, call me Sweet James, and I'd smile, my teeth clenched behind it. I followed her once. It was reckless, but I couldn't stop myself. She'd said she was meeting the group at a nature reserve. I tailed her from a distance, my old sedan blending into the Saturday traffic. She didn't go to the reserve. She pulled into a parking lot near the edge of town, and there he was, Elliot, leaning against a Jeep, his grin wide as she stepped out. They didn't touch, not at first, but the way she tilted her head, the way he laughed. It was intimate, practiced. My hands shook on the wheel, but I stayed still, watched them drive off together. That night, she came home with a story about spotting an owl. I nodded, asked questions I didn't care about, let her spin her web. Later, I checked the tracker. She'd been at the cabin again. I pictured them there, tangled in each other, her voice soft in ways it hadn't been for me in years. The thought didn't just hurt, it enraged me. I'd given her everything. Stability, a home, a life. And she'd traded it for some smug photographer with a cabin and a camera. I started digging into Elliot. Public records were easy. Divorce filed 3 years ago, a small inheritance that bought the cabin, a photography business that barely broke even. He wasn't rich, wasn't brilliant, just a man who knew how to charm. I found his social media, scrolled through posts of birds and sunsets, and there, buried in the comments, was Clara. Beautiful shot, E. My Clara. Calling him E. I wanted to smash the screen, but I didn't. I printed it instead, added it to my file. The revenge took shape in my mind. Not loud, not messy, but cold and deliberate. I'd make her feel what I felt, strip away what she'd built with him. I didn't know how yet, but I knew it'd be slow, a dismantling she wouldn't see coming. For now, I played the part, doting husband, oblivious fool, while the real me sharpened the blade in silence. Clara's birthday was in January, and I decided to test her. I planned a weekend away, just us, a cabin of our own, miles from Elliot's. A reset, I called it, smiling as I handed her the brochure. Her face flickered, surprise, then something else, unease. "Oh, James, that's sweet, but I've got a birding thing that weekend," she said, her voice too light, depressed. "Cancel it. For me." She hesitated, then nodded, but her eyes didn't meet mine. The trip never happened. 2 days before, she sprained her ankle on a walk. Nothing serious, she said, but enough to keep us home. I watched her limp around, favoring her left leg 1 hour, her right the next. No swelling, no bruise. I didn't call her out. Instead, I said, "Guess you'll miss the birding too." And she shrugged. Too quick. "Oh, I wasn't going anyway." The tracker told a different story. That Saturday, while I worked late, she drove to the cabin. She didn't limp when she left. I stopped pretending after that. Not outwardly. She still thought I was clueless, but inside, the husband she knew was gone. I started shadowing her more, learning their patterns. They met Tuesdays at the diner, Thursdays at the motel, weekends at the cabin. I photographed them once, from across the street, her hand brushing his arm, his head dipping close. The lens caught what my eyes couldn't bear, and I kept the print, a grainy testament to her lie. Elliot's life became my study. I found his ex-wife's blog, bitter posts about his wandering hands, his charm that rotted once you saw through it. I tracked his clients, his debts, his habits. He drank craft beer, shopped at the organic market, jogged every morning. Vulnerable spots, all of them. Clara's weaknesses were harder to pin. She'd buried them under years of routine. But I knew her too. Her pride, her need to be admired, her quiet vanity. I'd use it all. The plan crystallized one night as I sat alone. Her latest excuse, late meeting with the group, hanging in the air. Revenge wouldn't be an outburst, but a slow unraveling. I'd take her world, her affair, her lies, her precious Elliot, and turn it to ash. Not with my hands, not with words, but with something sharper, something she'd never recover from. I smiled into the dark, the first real smile in months. She'd see soon enough. Clara's lies were a rhythm now, predictable as the tides. She'd flutter around the house, her excuses polished, birding meetings, a friend's crisis, a sudden urge to clear her head. I stopped challenging them. My silence was my shield, letting her think she'd won. The tracker hummed in my pocket, a constant pulse of truth she didn't know I held. I'd watch the dot, her car, slide toward the cabin, the motel, the diner, and I'd sit in my office, the lights off, mapping her betrayal like a cartographer of ruin. I needed more than data. I needed her voice, her words, the proof of her heart spilling out. So I cloned her phone. It wasn't hard. A software trick from a shady corner of the internet, a sync while she slept. The first messages I read gutted me. "Elliot, you make me feel alive again," she'd written, time-stamped 2 a.m., when I'd been snoring beside her. His reply, "You're my muse, Clara. James doesn't see you like I do." My name in his mouth felt like a violation, but it lit a fire. They didn't just want each other, they wanted me erased. The texts painted their world. Stolen hours, whispered plans, her gushing about his artist soul. She'd sent him photos, nothing explicit but intimate. Her in that green scarf, her smiling by a creek, her hair loose in a way she never wore it for me. I saved them all, a gallery of her duplicity. One message stopped me cold. I wish I could leave him, but it's complicated. Complicated. 20 years, 2 kids, a life built brick by brick. And I was the complication. I didn't sleep that night. I shadowed them again, this time to the motel. I parked across the lot, watched her slip into room 12. Elliot's Jeep already there. The curtains stayed drawn, but I didn't need to see. I knew. An hour later, they emerged, her adjusting her scarf, him lighting a cigarette, their laughter cutting through the dusk. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, but I didn't move. Not yet. Rage was fuel now, not a flare to waste. The revenge was forming, a shadow taking shape. It wouldn't be loud or sudden. It'd be surgical, a wound they'd feel for years. I started small, testing the waters. I mailed Elliot an anonymous note. She's not yours alone. No signature, just block letters on plain paper, dropped in a public box. I watched his face the next day, jogging his usual route, his brow furrowed, his pace off. Clara didn't mention it, but her phone buzzed more, her replies to him shorter, clipped. The seed was planted. Doubt was my first weapon. I fed it to them in drips. Another note to Elliot. Ask her about the weekends she's not with you. A text from a burner phone to Clara. Does he know everything? She came home jittery that night, her smile forced. Rough day, she muttered, pouring wine with unsteady hands. I asked if something was wrong. My voice mild, and she snapped, No, James, just tired. I nodded, sipped my coffee, let her stew. The texts between them spiked, her asking if he'd told anyone, him swearing he hadn't. I upped the game. I hacked his photography site. Nothing fancy, just a password guess, hummingbird one, the fool, and uploaded a photo. Clara's face, blurred but recognizable, beside one of his bird shots. I titled it Muse. It stayed up 12 hours before he noticed, but the damage was done. Clients emailed him, confused. His ex-wife left a scathing comment. Clara called in sick the next day, her eyes red. A cold, she said. I brought her soup, played the doting husband, watched her squirm. Their meetings faltered. The tracker showed shorter trips, fewer overnights. I listened to her calls. Elliot's voice tight, hers pleading. We need to be careful, she said once, thinking I was asleep. Careful. Too late for that. I sent more notes, vague but pointed. She lies to you too. To him. He's not who you think. To her. Their trust frayed, threads I tugged loose. I wanted them paranoid, turning on each other before I struck the real blow. I dug into Elliot's past next. His ex-wife's blog was a goldmine, hints of gambling debts, a temper she glossed over in public. I called a guy I knew, a private investigator from a tax fraud case years back. Discreet, I told him, handing over cash. He came back with dirt. Elliot owed money to a bookie, small time but desperate. I filed that away. Leverage. Clara's weakness was softer. Her pride. Her need to be seen as good. I'd shatter both. The house felt like a stage now. She'd flutter around, oblivious to my script, while I rehearsed in silence. One night, she left her scarf on the counter. Green, wrinkled, a taunt. I picked it up, ran it through my fingers, then tossed it in the laundry with bleach. She found it the next day, faded to a sickly gray, and gasped. James, how did this happen? I shrugged. Must have gotten mixed up. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Good. Let her wonder. I turned their world into a maze. The investigator got me photos. Elliot meeting his bookie, cash changing hands in a dim alley. I mailed one to Clara, no note, just the image. She didn't bring it up, but her phone calls to him grew sharp, accusing. What's going on, Elliot? Who's following you? He denied it, his voice cracking through the clone app. I smiled into my coffee. She'd always hated messiness. Now her perfect affair was unraveling. Elliot's turn came next. I sent him a screenshot of her text. "I wish I could leave him," cropped to hide his reply. "She's playing you," I wrote beneath it. His jogging stopped. He paced his porch instead, phone in hand, arguing with her in bursts I couldn't hear but could guess. Their cabin trips dropped to once a week, then nothing. The tracker showed her circling town instead, restless, alone. I caged them both without lifting a finger. I escalated. I called the birding group's leader, feigning concern. "Clara's been so distracted lately. Everything okay with the trips?" The woman hesitated, then said, "She hasn't been to a meeting in months." I thanked her, hung up, and waited. That night I asked Clara about the group, casual as ever. Her face froze, then smoothed. "Oh, it's been slow lately," she lied. I nodded, let it hang. She didn't sleep well after that. I heard her pacing, the floorboards creaking under her guilt. Elliot's debts were my next move. I tipped the bookie anonymously, Elliot's new photography gig, a cash deposit he'd bragged about online. 2 days later, the investigator sent me a photo. Elliot, bruised, limping from his Jeep. Clara rushed out that night, no excuse, just a slammed door. The tracker led her to his place, not the cabin. She came back at dawn, her scarf gone, her eyes hollow. I made breakfast, hummed as I cooked, let her feel the weight of my calm. The revenge was blooming, but it wasn't enough. I wanted her to see it, her life with him, her lies all crumbling. Not just feel it in shadows. I started leaving hints. A motel key on her nightstand. No explanation. A printout of his website crash in her purse. She'd find them, go silent, then overcompensate. Cooking my favorite meals, clinging to me like she could rewind time. I ate the food, returned the hugs, and planned the final act. Clara broke first. She came home one evening, her face pale, hands trembling. "James, we need to talk," she said, her voice a thread. I sat, waited, my pulse steady. She stammered through it. How she'd grown apart from me. How she'd met someone. How it was over now. Elliot's name spilled out, timid, like she was testing my reaction. I didn't flinch. "I know," I said, flat. Her eyes widened, but I didn't elaborate. "I just need you to understand," she whispered. I nodded, said nothing. She thought it was forgiveness. It wasn't. Elliot was unraveling too. The bookie's pressure tightened. His Jeep got repossessed. His clients dropped off after I leaked rumors of his unreliability through a fake email. Clara didn't know I'd done it, but she felt the fallout. She'd vent to him on the phone, her voice sharp. "You said you had it under control." He'd snap back, blaming her for the mess. I listened through the clone, sipping whiskey, letting their collapse fuel me. I staged the next blow. I rented a billboard near Elliot's house. His face, her scarf, the word muse in bold. No context, just enough to twist the knife. He saw it first, called her in a panic. She drove to him, the tracker pinging wildly, and they fought in his driveway, her yelling, him gesturing at the sign. Neighbors watched, phones out. By morning, it was online, a local mystery. Clara came home sobbing, claiming harassment. I held her, murmured comfort, my hands cold against her shaking frame. Her pride was cracking. She stopped leaving the house, her binoculars gathering dust. I fed her doubt daily, offhand comments about trust, loyalty, how some people don't deserve what they have. She'd flinch, change the subject, but the words stuck. Elliot's life was worse. Eviction notice on his cabin, his camera gear pawned. I'd nudged the bank with an anonymous tip about his missed payments. He texted her less, his tone bitter. She'd stare at her phone, lost, while I sharpened the final edge. The endgame loomed. I didn't want her begging, not yet. I wanted her hollowed out, stripped of the woman she'd become with him. I booked a dinner, told her it was to reconnect. She agreed, hesitant, her eyes searching mine. I smiled, the husband she remembered, and she relaxed. Too soon, Clara. Too soon. The meal would be her last taste of normal before I turned the blade she didn't see coming. Dinner was quiet, deliberate. I chose her favorite place. Italian, dim lights, the hum of other lives around us. She wore a dress I'd bought her years ago. Blue, simple, a relic of when she dressed for me. I ordered wine, poured hers first, watched her sip it like it could steady her. "You've been distant," I said, my tone soft, probing. She fidgeted, said she'd been figuring things out. I nodded, let her talk about the kids, the house, anything but him. She didn't mention Elliot. Neither did I. Not yet. Halfway through the meal, I slid a folder across the table. "What's this?" she asked, her fork pausing. "Open it," I said, my voice even. She did, and her breath caught. Photos, her and Elliot at the motel, the diner, his porch. Texts, printed. Her words to him glowing in black ink. The motel key, the website screenshot, the billboard design. Her hands shook, the folder trembling as she flipped through it. "James, she started, but I raised a hand. "Don't." She stared at me, eyes wet, mouth working soundlessly. "How long?" she whispered. "Long enough," I said. I leaned in, my voice low. "You thought I was blind, Clara. You thought I'd sit here while you built a life with him. I didn't." She shrank back, the woman who'd hummed on our porch gone, replaced by this fragile stranger. I didn't yell, didn't accuse. I laid out the truth like a ledger, balanced and cold. I told her about the tracker, the notes, the leaks that gutted Elliot's world. Her face crumpled as I described his debts, his bruises, the billboard that turned their secret into a spectacle. "You ruined him," she choked out. "No," I said. "You did. I just pulled the strings." She pushed the folder away, tears streaking her cheeks, but I wasn't done. I slid one last photo across, her scarf, gray and ruined, pinned to a tree near his cabin. "You left this behind," I said. She sobbed, head in her hands. The restaurant hummed on, oblivious. I paid the bill, stood, offered her my arm. She took it, dazed, and we drove home in silence. That night, she slept on the couch, her breathing uneven. I sat in my office, the folder open, and felt the weight lift. Not joy, not peace, but a hollow satisfaction. The real revenge wasn't the dinner, wasn't the ruin I'd already sown. It was what came next, the final cut she'd never see until it was too late. Clara didn't speak to me for days after the dinner. She moved through the house like a ghost, her eyes sunken, her hands idle. The binoculars stayed untouched, her phone silent, Elliot's number blocked. I assumed, though I didn't check, I'd already won that battle. The folder sat on my desk, a silent sentinel, and she avoided my office like it was cursed. I let her drift, let the quiet stretch, knowing it was eating her alive. Silence was my ally now, heavier than any words I could have thrown at her. I wasn't done. The ruin I'd brought to Elliot was a prelude, a warm-up for the real strike. Clara's confession at dinner had been her surrender, but I didn't want her tears. I wanted her stripped bare, her pride flayed until she couldn't recognize herself. I started with the kids. Not directly, they didn't need to know the details, but I planted seeds. "Your mom's been struggling," I told Mia over the phone, my voice heavy with concern. "She might need to talk to you soon." Mia, sweet Mia, promised to call her. Clara wouldn't know why, not yet. Next, I turned to her world outside us. The birding group had a newsletter, a quaint thing emailed monthly. I kept the leader's contact from my earlier call. Anonymously, I sent her a tip. "Clara Grayson's been lying about her trips. Check her attendance." Grayson, Elliot's name, not mine, slipped in like a blade. The newsletter came out a week later, a small note tucked in the corner. "We're sad to see Clara Grayson step back from the group. Wishing her well." Clara saw it, froze, then threw it in the trash. I watched from the doorway, said nothing. Elliot's collapse was nearly complete. The investigator sent me updates. His cabin foreclosed, his gear gone, his name mud in the photography circles I'd poisoned. I mailed him one last package. A photo of Clara's ruined scarf, a single line beneath it. "She's done with you." He didn't reply, didn't fight back. He was broken, a husk I'd hollowed out. But Clara was my focus now. Her lover's fall was just the echo. Her own would be the scream. The final act began with a letter. I drafted it carefully, mimicking her cursive. Hours of practice with old notes she'd written me. To my family, it started. I've been living a lie. I betrayed James, betrayed you all with a man named Elliot Grayson. I'm leaving to find myself. I didn't send it yet. It was the keystone, the piece that'd lock her ruin in place. I tucked it away, waited for the moment. She thought the worst was over. She was wrong. Clara tried to rebuild. She started cooking again, elaborate meals she hadn't made in years. Roasts, pies, my old favorites. I want us to be okay, she said one night, her voice small, her eyes pleading. I ate the food, thanked her, kept my face neutral. She took it as hope, clung to it like a lifeline. I let her. Every bite was a step deeper into the trap she didn't see. She'd lost Elliot, lost her group, lost her footing. Now I take her identity, the last thing she had left. I leaked the letter online first. Not to the kids, not yet, but to a local gossip forum, anonymous, vague enough to stir curiosity. Found this in a trash bin. Someone's confessing an affair. Clara G. Married to a James. Wild stuff. The post spread, whispers curling through our suburb like smoke. People stared at her in the grocery store, their smiles tight. She noticed, came home rattled. Why are they looking at me like that? She asked. I shrugged. Small towns, I said. She bought it, but the doubt gnawed at her. The kids called. Mia first, then Ben, both worried. Mom, what's going on? People are texting me weird things. Clara fumbled. Said it was a misunderstanding. Her voice cracking. I listened from the hall, my chest tight but steady. She hung up, turned to me, desperate. James, help me fix this. I nodded, promised to look into it. Did nothing. The letter's shadow grew. Neighbors whispered. Her old friends texted less. She shrank, her confidence bleeding out. Elliot surfaced once more. A drunken voicemail, left on her phone while I listened through the clone. You ruined me, Clara. That letter, everyone knows. She deleted it pale, but I'd already saved it. I sent it to the forum, fuel on the fire. The next day, a coworker mentioned it to me. Heard about some drama with your wife, James. Rough. I played shocked. Thanked him for the heads up. Went home to find Clara curled on the couch, staring at nothing. I left the real letter on the kitchen table that night. She found it at dawn, her gasp sharp in the stillness. James, what is this? She demanded, holding it up. I looked at her, calm. What you wrote, I said. No, I didn't, she cried, but her voice wavered. She knew how it looked. Her handwriting, her secrets, her shame. You're framing me, she whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The trap was set and she was caught. Clara unraveled fast. She called the kids, sobbing, swearing the letter wasn't hers. They listened, but I'd primed them, weeks of subtle hints about her struggles, her distance. Mia was gentle, Ben skeptical. Mom, just tell us the truth, he said, his voice hard. She couldn't. The truth was hers, but the lie was mine, and mine was winning. She hung up, turned to me wild-eyed. You did this. You're destroying me. I met her gaze steady. You destroyed us first, I said. She flinched, fled to the bedroom, locked the door. The town ate it up. The forum exploded. Speculation, screenshots, someone claiming they'd seen her with that photographer guy. Her name was Mud, her face a cautionary tale. She stopped leaving the house, let the garden wilt, let the phone ring unanswered. I kept up appearances, went to work, nodded at the whispers, played the wounded husband with quiet dignity. People pitied me, offered coffee, awkward pats on the back. I took it all, let it build the myth. Elliot vanished. The investigator said he'd left town, broke and disgraced. Last seen hawking his camera for bus fare. I didn't care. He was collateral, a pawn I'd knocked off the board. Clara was the queen, and I was checkmating her slow. I mailed the letter to her sister next with a note. Found this, thought you should know. Her sister called, furious, left a voicemail Clara wouldn't play. How could you do this to James? It started. I heard it anyway, smiled into the dark. She confronted me again, the letter clutched in her fist. You forged it. I know you did. I leaned back, crossed my arms. Prove it, I said. She couldn't. The handwriting was too good, the details too real, her affair, her shame, all woven into a noose she'd tied herself. She threw the letter at me, stormed out. I picked it up, smoothed it, added it to the folder. The end was close now, the final cut ready. I slept soundly that night, the first time in months. Clara didn't. I heard her pacing, muttering, breaking. She thought she could fight back, maybe confess, maybe run. She wouldn't. I'd taken her voice, her allies, her world. All she had left was me, and I was the blade she'd never escape. The morning would bring the last stroke, the one she'd carry forever. I woke early, made coffee, set the table for two. Clara emerged, hollow-eyed, her hair tangled. She sat, stared at the mug I slid her way. We're done, aren't we? She asked, her voice a rasp. I didn't answer, just sipped my coffee, let her feel the weight. She'd stopped fighting, stopped denying. The letter had done its work, a virus I'd planted in her life. I didn't need to say more. She knew what she'd lost, what I'd taken. I handed her divorce papers. Not loud, not dramatic, just a folder, like the one at dinner, slid across the table. Sign them, I said. She opened it, scanned the terms. I kept the house, the savings, most of what we'd built. She got her car, her clothes, a small stipend to start over. Her hands shook, but she didn't argue. You've already ruined me, she whispered. Not quite, I said and stood. The real blow was still coming. I sold the story. Not to a tabloid, too cheap, but to a writer I knew, a quiet man who'd turned tax fraud into a novel years back. I gave him everything. The tracker logs, the photos, the texts, the letter. Names changed, details blurred, but anyone who knew us would see it. He'd titled it The Hummingbird's Shadow, pitched it as a tale of trust and vengeance. The advance check came that week. I cashed it, put it in a new account, let Clara wonder where the money went. She signed the papers that afternoon, her pen scratching like a dying breath. I loved you, she said, tears streaking the ink. You loved him more, I replied and took the folder back. She packed a bag, left the scarf behind, gray, useless, a relic of her fall. I watched her drive away, the tracker still on her car, though I didn't need it now. She'd go to her sister, maybe, or a motel. It didn't matter. Her life was ash and I'd lit the match. The book hit shelves 6 months later. I sent her a copy inscribed, To Clara, who inspired it all. She'd see it in stores, hear it whispered, her shame immortalized, her betrayal a bestseller. I'd moved on by then, sold the house, started fresh. But she'd carry it, the weight of my revenge. Every time someone asked, Didn't you used to be Clara Grayson? The aftermath was quiet, final. Clara faded from my world, a shadow I'd banished. The kids came around, slowly, warily. After I told them a sanitized version, Your mom made choices, and we couldn't stay together. They didn't ask for more, didn't need to. The book filled the gaps, a fiction they'd never linked to me directly, but its echo lingered. Mia visited once, saw it on my shelf, frowned. Weird title, she said. I smiled, said nothing. Elliot was a ghost story now. The investigator tracked him to a coastal town, washing dishes, his hands raw from bleach. I didn't follow up. He'd been a tool, not the target. His ruin was incidental, a ripple from the stone I'd thrown at her. Clara, though, I heard whispers. Living with her sister, working odd jobs, her laughter gone. Friends sent me updates, unasked. Pity for me, scorn for her. I nodded, thanked them, let the myth grow. The money from the book was good. Not lavish, but enough to buy a condo, a new car, a life untainted by her lavender candles. I took up gardening, ironic maybe, roses, not hummingbirds. The quiet suited me, the numbers of my new world adding up clean. I didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. Revenge wasn't joy. It was balance. A ledger squared after years of her debt. She wrote me once, a year later. A shaky note, no return address. I'm sorry, James. I see it now. I read it, burned it, watched the ashes curl. Sorry didn't undo her choices. Didn't erase the green scarf or the cabin or the way she'd lit up for him. I'd seen it too, her betrayal, her lies, and I'd made her see it back, reflected in a mirror she couldn't shatter. I sit on my porch now, coffee in hand, the roses blooming. The symphony's mine again, steady, mine alone. Clara's out there, somewhere, carrying the weight I gave her. A story she can't rewrite, a revenge she'll never outrun. I sip my coffee, let the morning settle, and feel the calm of a man who's settled the score.